All right. I hope I'm loud enough. Sometimes I don't use a microphone, but I think today I'll have to use that because everybody needs to hear me from a distance. I think as had been mentioned initially, I come from a school of thought called political ecology. I know most of you are familiar with political science, and so when I talk about political ecology, you start wondering, is there politics in ecology? Of course there is, because all we are doing today is actually politics. We are trying to convince people to see things our way, and that's all the essence of politics. And of course, the two presenters, as has been mentioned, have done a wonderful job. And I think most of what I'll be talking about is simply trying now to put into perspective some of the frameworks and tools that then we can use to realize what they have said. And of course, there are several other tools that you can use, but I think we will pick on one called ecosystem-based management as one of the tools we can employ. So, first slide, please. Oh, yeah. All right. So as they work on the technicalities. Now, my talk is about ecosystem-based management. And so what that means is the essence of ecosystems. And I think it's very important to understand what that means and what is the value of ecosystems to us, both for humanity, but also for nature. And so in a nutshell, when we talk about ecosystems, we are referring to that combination, the mix and match of what nature provides and what people can benefit from. And of course, when the slide comes up, my first slide simply tries to emphasize the value of ecosystems and their services to humanity. And of course, a number of them that have been highlighted include what's called the ecosystem's functions. What sort of provisional services do we get from there? Food, what sort of waste management, cultural benefits, things like aesthetics. Many of us spend time out in the open to enjoy nature. While we are here at the coast, a number of us go down, the seashore to try and swim. But also in other places, for those of us coming up country, we visit forested areas, protected areas, to try and get several benefits from nature. Now, these are things that are in most cases not quantifiable, but then they make us who we are. We enjoy a lot from that. And with specific reference to the oceans and the marine ecosystem, there are benefits that we've also actually overlooked, like the seafoods that we get from there, the issues of climate change regulation. We've just talked about climate change being a major threat as we go into the future. But I think it's also important to understand the mechanism. How does that work in a sense? So issues of CO2 absorption in the oceans, that is quite critical to us. So we really have to think through from a planning perspective how to ensure that those benefits continuously are available for us to enjoy in a way that ensures sustainability. So even though we get a lot of benefits from the ecosystems, they are continuously under threat. And interestingly, this threat is not natural. It comes from human activities. It comes from our planning practices. It comes from our natural resource extraction practices. How do we ensure that we survive? So all these include things like overfishing or overexploitation of fishes, as well as bycatch in the oceans. Habitat loss is another big problem. Pollution, we just given lots of examples here of waste being dumped into the oceans. Sometimes we tend to think that the oceans are indepletable. And so we continuously dump waste and let it deal with it. But in reality, it gets to a turning point where it can no longer contain it and it fights back. There are coastal development issues. So one of the projects I'm running right now is called Development Corridors Partnership. And I look at the impacts of the standard gauge railway in Kenya, as well as the Lapsset corridor. And the interesting bit is both projects actually originate from the coastal cities of Mombasa and Lamu. And so there are lots of possible impacts that are arising from these projects that perhaps were not taken into account at the beginning. Beyond that, there are other associated projects that are also occurring at the coastal region, including the expansion of existing urban centers, but also the emergence of new urban centers. Do we have measures in place to ensure that they don't impact on the ecosystems and the services we enjoy? Issues of mining, as well as other human activities, are quite prevalent, and they are bound to affect the ecosystems. Beyond that, on the natural side, climate change is a major threat. And as we've now known, climate change originates from human activities as well, and therefore it's an extension of our negligence, if I may use that term. Issues of CO2 concentration. As I mentioned, CO2 is absorbed in the oceans, acidification arises, and that affects the ecosystem balance or the eco-balance in the oceans. And that might result in species disappearance, as well as other impacts like ocean stratification is affected. And so in the process of planning, we also have to think through how the wastes are being dumped, how the gases that originate from the industrial development are being handled, and how those, if not handled properly, can result in ecosystem destruction. So the way we've tried to address some of these challenges is actually, the screen has disappeared. All right. So one of the ways we've tried to address some of these challenges, traditionally, is to work in silos. We've got institutions all over the world that then address specific problems. So for instance, if people want to talk about the land problems, we've got the ministry and the relevant departments handling land issues in isolation, water issues in isolation, biodiversity issues in isolation. So that's what we call the silo-structured approach to management of ecosystems. It has a problem because it focuses on individual species, individual human activities being evaluated, management by individual sectors, as I've mentioned, but also is narrowly focused on scientific monitoring programs. We only want to look at, for instance, a specific species of fishes. And so all our efforts and resources are focused around its survival without necessarily looking at the interaction with the wider ecosystem. And finally, the conservation that serves a single use and purpose. So we've had programs, and this goes to most of us who write proposals, particularly the dons, and we get funding to tackle a problem for a period of 3 years. And our focus and energies around that period to the extent that when the project funding ends, the entire project collapses. So what happens to the data, what happens to the recommendations sometimes really becomes very vague. So we must think through in a more holistic manner as to where does the data end. And perhaps I'll talk a little bit about that in what I'm doing with the Development Corridors Partnership. I think yesterday I saw some members of KENHA around. So in that project, what we are trying to do is to develop project objectives that have got the user in mind. Who are we targeting with these objectives? When the data comes out, when the recommendations come out, where does it go? Because as a researcher, for instance, my role might end with the production of evidence and the recommendations. But then I've got the government departments and agencies that are charged with the mandate to see some of these recommendations over a longer period of time. So at what stage do I engage them? And we'll see this tool gives us some options on how we can engage with a wider perspective. So we really need to think through and get out of those, single purpose objectives or other projects to projects that have got longevity in mind. So there is therefore a general consensus on the need to improve in the conventional management practices. That's something we've all agreed, and I think that's why you invited us here today. We are not planners per se, but we are also planners, by virtue of the work we do in research and generating evidence. And therefore, we need to move back. So maybe if you can go to slide, go back. There you are. So we need to move away from the current silo structure to a more holistic approach. And therefore, our work needs to focus on the multiple species. We also have to look at humans being part of that process. We cannot plan for nature with ourselves excluded, and then we assume that the oceans and the forests and land is actually somewhere else, so that we are sitting down to plan on how it's supposed to be used. Our presence within the process must be combined. So in other areas, we call that socio-ecological thinking. Together with us, we are in the process. If we plan without us in the mix, chances are that when the impacts arise, we become the victims because we didn't think about the impacts on ourselves. We also need to work in collaboration. That's what's called the multisectoral approach. It is true that as a conservationist and a researcher, I might not be an expert in planning. But also as a planner, you might not have the benefit of designing a research project. So how we combine the two is quite critical in a way that the evidence and the data I gather in the field can be utilized to support you in your planning. But also your expertise in planning can then be used to interpret my data in a way that becomes sensible to your use. In most cases for us, we do our research, publish papers in the journals, and move to the next project. How do I ensure that you as the planner or decision maker is able to utilize my data properly? We must work together from a multisectoral resource approach. Adaptive management based on scientific monitoring. In other words, we believe that nature or ecosystems are dynamic. They change every now and then based on the pressures and other issues originating from external sources. So we cannot say that we set an objective in 2018 and in 2020 we still go with the same objective. We have to be adaptable. We have to be able to change with the changing scenarios as we go along with our scientific monitoring. That ensures that the data we generate is always serving the present needs, but also is able to be projected to the future. The other bit is about shared standardized observations. We cannot be able to talk about a specific resource if it is the oceans, and yet one institution looks at it from a perspective of a dumping site, while the other institution looks at it from a perspective of a resource that needs to sustain humanity. We must develop that standardized way of looking at some of these resources, and then we can be able to generate or develop proper management approaches. So therefore, one of the ways of addressing this is to identify tools that really encompass a holistic way of looking at them, and therefore it should be a tool that offers better knowledge. So that should be knowledge, not acknowledge. So it offers better knowledge. What is it that we need to learn about a specific resource? What is it that we don't know? And what is the need? Or what do we really need to know? So that process must really be something that offers relevant data, relevant information. So for example, we look at population abundance of different species. We want to look at their structure. We want to look at the life histories. We cannot plan for something or a resource if you don't know how much pressure it has undergone. Number two, it must incorporate aspects such as biodiversity, because biodiversity is the origin of all forms of life. We cannot plan for the living if we do not really incorporate that living in the process of planning. So we have to look at how there's competition within that ecosystem amongst different species, humans included, where the stock is placed within the food web, for instance. So if you look at some of the biodiversities, they depend on each other for their survival. And of course, human beings being the apex consumer, we also have to think through. If we lose certain species of fishes in the ocean, then what are we going to do? I think the previous speaker just mentioned something about fishermen complaining about the fish catch changing, but also different species disappearing. What does that mean for us going forward? Are we still going to continue enjoying the resources we get from there? If we don't think through that, then we get to a point where we no longer get what we want, and we don't know when it actually started disappearing. It must also account for the complexity of socio-ecological systems. It is always dynamic. People needs change. Politics of the day change. Governance structures change. People's aspirations and visions also change. How do we take care of all this in our planning? Like had been mentioned initially, some of the new and emerging municipalities are emerging because of the needs to address the current administrative as well as access issues. How do we ensure that our planning can be able to preempt and plan for that? So that, complex changes that occur in our ecosystems or in our surrounding must be taken into account. It also should offer opportunities for stakeholder participation. There is no way we are going to plan in isolation. All of us compete for the same resources. Who knew that at one point, people in different sectors, in infrastructure, planning, will be talking about climate change? Because the reality is it's affecting your activities on a daily basis. In our conversations with the infrastructure institutions, for instance, there was the mention about not having incorporated the future climate change scenarios. And therefore, roads were constructed with the technical and engineering thinking only for them to collapse as a result of, heavy rains and flooding, but also, the changes in hydrology. So these are things that sometimes had never really become central considerations for certain institutions, but today they really have to think through that because they are directly affecting and impacting on their activity. So all the stakeholders need to participate, from communities to the research institutions to government institutions and other agencies and all the other individuals that are really interested. And finally, there must be proper incentive. I always say this: what is the need for me? So if you're not clear about the value of the contribution of that specific activity to me, then chances are I'll not be motivated to participate. So we really have to be clear, and that's why I talked about the politics at the beginning. How do I demonstrate to you that whatever you are doing today has got an impact on your life 10 years to come. So that incentive to protect myself, for the institutions, incentives for recognition, must really be articulated properly so that all the stakeholders see the value and the reason for them to participate. It cannot be done by ways of coercion or by ways of regulations. Regulations are good, and this is something I really want to talk about. Kenya, for instance, has been identified as one of the countries in the African continent having very good regulations, policies, and they're very progressive. But on the other side, Kenya is one of the countries that's also suffering from the highest levels of environmental degradation and ignorance to the same law. Why is that? Because perhaps our approach to the formation of these laws and regulations has never thought through the issues of incentives. What is it that motivates us to destroy the environment? What is it that motivates us not to think through the waste management process? Where we place our emphasis, perhaps, is not where the law wants us to go. So if you are able to engage from the beginning so that we all see the same incentive as to why we want to go forward, it might make all the difference, coming together and ensuring that we have a shared goal and a shared vision. So these considerations are reflected in one of the systems that I've just mentioned, the ecosystems-based approach or management. It is a process, or it's a system that then allows us to think through broadly. I'll not go through those definitions, those are more academic. But what I want to talk about generally is just what does ecosystem-based management really entails? You know, that holistic thinking, how it looks at the ecosystems as a whole. As I've mentioned what an ecosystem is, you really cannot think in isolation. We can't think in silos or in sectors and want to develop an entire society. We must think through the benefits, the costs that different segments of the society incur. We must think about stakeholder involvement, but also multiple as well as simultaneous drivers or pressures. What is it that destroys the ecosystem? Is it the overexploitation on the one side or the desire to protect them on the other side? How do they interact? So we must always think about some of those drivers of overexploitation, the national and natural pressures such as climate change, amongst others. And finally, it should be a tool or something that can be applied both in the terrestrial as well as marine ecosystems or aquatic ecosystems. In other words, when you think about ecosystems, like I mentioned, we don't have forests on the other side and the rivers and lakes on the other side. They all work together. As we know, rivers originate from the forests. I think that's common sense in some places, what we call the catchment areas. But where do they flow to? They pass through farms and they pass through urban centers, and people use that water for their survival. Some use it for their farming, and eventually it ends up in the rivers, or in this case, the tanners and what have you, ends up in the oceans. So you cannot therefore think about Mau Forest or Mount Kenya Forest or Aberdare Forest in isolation of where the waters end up. You must think about it holistically. We have a situation, for instance, where the city of Mombasa is currently using water from Mzima Springs in Kibwezi. So if you're planning for Mombasa County, you cannot plan for it in isolation from Kibwezi County, because if the Kibwezi people decide to destroy the source of that water, you're doomed in Mombasa. So you really have to think through in that way. So it has to be applicable in both scenarios. So one example of where it's been applied is with the marine and fisheries ecosystems. And so this one was applied by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, thank you. And what this tries to look through is where it began at the bottom of that chart, where the focus was on a single species of fish. And then it moves on to look at ecosystems approach to fisheries management, but still focusing on a single species of fish and how other factors like climate, habitat change, as well as predator interact with them. But that wasn't sufficient, because then we are not looking at other fishes that might offer alternative predation, but also other factors other than climate that might also affect that habitat. And so it moved on to what's called ecosystem-based fisheries management. So this one now incorporated several other fish species, but still focused on climate, habitat, and the predators. And so that felt quite inadequate, because in the absence of climate, then we realized, or rather, the data actually confirmed that we still had fish species that were being affected. And so the thinking of ecosystem-based approach then came up. And what it does is quite interesting then, because it now looks at several other pressures and several other drivers. In this case, we look at urban development, for instance, energy requirements, ecotourism activities, oil and gas exploration, conservation issues, the overall marine activities like transportation, emergence of sanctuaries, aquaculture, as well as several other factors. So it then gives you an opportunity to throw in several indicators and try to eliminate them one after the other, and you have the liberty now to give us a more holistic picture of what is really ailing that entire ecosystem. So then, how do we move forward from there, particularly for our purpose of sitting here today? The tool can be good, but it's only as good, it's only as good as if it can be applied effectively and efficiently, and then it's able to achieve its objectives. So number one, we look at some of the considerations you have to think through. Number one is that the ecosystem-based management is about sustainability. In other words, the management objectives must include issues of social, economic, and ecological considerations, that entire interaction, and think about the trade-offs. What is it that you are willing to lose to get the bigger picture? What is it that you see if you lose, then the bigger picture is compromised? So think about the trade-offs involved. It must also deal with different ecosystems and institutional settings that require multi-level governance. How you deal with communities or direct fishermen is different from how you're going to deal with the government ministries that are supposed to put in place policies. So that entire spectrum requires a bit of creativity and how you are going to engage them in the process to ensure their sustainability. It also requires cross-sectoral coordination and the integration of sectoral concerns and management. The issue of incentives. What is in it for me? Why would the Ministry of Agriculture want to sit down with the Ministry of Water? Why would planners want to sit down with conservationists? Why would infrastructure institutions want to sit down with biodiversity institutions? That shared vision, that common agenda, and the thinking that your planning affects biodiversity. My needs to protect biodiversity affects planning. And at this stage, I'll refer to the presentation that was given initially about, that uprooting of the mature tree and relocating it. Those of us from Nairobi who are familiar with the Westlands issue, where there's that big tree left in the middle of the road somewhere. Well, I'm one of the people who demonstrated against it, but I realize now, we actually criticized, but we didn't offer solution. So that tree is left there, but the question is for how long? That's a reality, because at one point, somebody will have to make a decision on what to do with it. Some of those technologies that have been mentioned are things that we can bring on board and try to see if they can work for us. The challenge sometimes is that lack of coordination, lack of consultation. And as we'll see in the other slides, how do we ensure that the consultation is meaningful and ensures trust and something that can be treated as relevant to all of us? So those are issues that really require that we act cross-sectorally. Although you have a specific mandate, we must be clear as to how your mandate conflicts with my mandate and how do we reconcile those conflicts. That's quite critical, and that's what ecosystem-based management really tries to address. So one way of doing that, one way of doing that is really to look through some of the principles or some of the dimensions of ecosystem-based management. And it looks at the three specific areas. That is, decision makers on one side, scientists on one side, as well as other sectors. Now, when you talk of other sectors, we refer to every other individual involved in the process. It's not really that the other sectors are inferior, but it's just that there are so many, we can't start listing them. So including planners, including infrastructure, conservation, and the civil society, they all have specific interests. So the advantage of this thing we call the three dimensions, or the triangle, is basically to offer some kind of a framework to think through when you want to deploy ecosystem-based management. So it kind of offers some interactions. It is driven by the interactions between these three dimensions. And the first is the interaction between decision makers and scientists. Decision makers on one side and other actors, as well as scientists and other actors. And then, of course, the dark ones there on the outer side of that triangle shows the levels of those interactions. So either there's no interaction completely, there's indirect interaction, or there's direct interaction. It is you to choose which level you want to involve yourself in, but it's advisable that the no interaction bit is thought through clearly because it might be the downfall. In terms of the scientists and other actors, there's the issue of the, thinking through single interactions with specific institutions, or you want to involve multi-institutions, but that should be based on thinking whether you want to do an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary approach to your work. And I think that's quite critical because today's planning doesn't require specific or one discipline. You really have to think through, like I mentioned, what is the politics of that issue, what is the ecology of that issue, what are the economic considerations, what are the social and cultural considerations. There are things that can always succeed if they address some of the cultural issues. There are communities in Africa that are so, attached to their ecosystems or their, environment in a way that if you want, for instance, construct a road, it's going to be a real struggle. They are not willing to let go. Some of the areas have got those traditional, homesteads where people were buried and the likes. And I think Kenya, for instance, and the SGR team, the Kenya Railways, have got first-hand experience by when they try to relocate people in the process of creating room for the construction of their infrastructure. So thinking through how to go around those issues is quite critical. Between decision makers and other actors, again, is this centralistic or is it more or less, you are instructing others to do things? It doesn't work. Even though you might have the authority as the government institution, you cannot come and tell people what you want them to do. It has to be consultative. People need to be engaged. Their views must be there. And the emphasis is on what's called equity. How do we ensure that people feel satisfied that they were adequately consulted and their views were taken? Of course, we know it can never be that sufficient, but at least some semblance of consultation will build the confidence and the trust in a way that members will be able to participate. Now, this one is also based on certain drivers. Like I did mention, in the center of the chart, where we have the ecosystem-based management, there are certain drivers that you must think through that really ensure that you make certain decisions that can be, next. Oh, there you go. So in the center of that chart of the triangle, the ones listed there are some of the drivers to consider. Not all of them, but just a few for the sake of our training, of our discussions today that can really help you think through. Next. So one of them is the issue of resources at the top. So this in terms of time, in terms of money, space, manpower, interactions, the fora that you want to use, or the channels, the language, and the capacities. Do we have enough resources to do this? Do we have the capacity to implement this? So that's quite critical. Issues of trust, for instance. Is this something that is capable? Do they trust? Those are questions you must think through. Quality of knowledge. What sort of evidence do we have to help us make these decisions? Is it something that is believable? Is it based on scientific rigor? Is it something that really can make us think through to the next stage, or after a short while, we are going to change? And finally, willingness. What is in it for me? That incentive bit. Am I willing to be consulted? Or is the person I'm consulting willing to share their information and engage with me? That is very critical, because otherwise you will act in a way that at the end of the day, your results or your plan is actually rejected, and then you go back to square one. So you really have to build that consensus from the very onset. So like I mentioned, some of the things to think through, the challenges at the moment, next. The challenges at the moment is that collaboration, being interdisciplinary, is not easy to achieve. So you must have that at the back of your mind, because not everybody is willing to share what they know or what they have, unless they are very sure that they are going to meet some of their values. But also some of the institutions have got specific culture and values that they perhaps are not willing to let go. So how do we break through those barriers? It's quite critical. You must be very clear about the roles and responsibilities of different participants. Without that, nobody wants to participate for the sake of it. What are they going to do specifically? What is the scope of their work, and what is the outcome? It is also very costly. And so, like I mentioned, doing all that requires resources, both personnel and financial resources that you have to think through. Conflicts that arise because of those multiplicities is quite critical. So it takes time to build consensus, and it takes time to build trust. So you have to be prepared for some of those constant issues. So how then do we address that? For YOMSA, for instance, we've been able to put through a short training next week that's supposed to help some of the practitioners really see how they can apply some of the tools in those scenarios in a way that's going to make the work much easier. So one of the projects that we are running this time around is called Building Capacities of Local Practitioners for the Assessment of the Dynamics. Thank you. For the assessment of the dynamics of ecosystems in the emerging coastal towns in the Western Indian Ocean region. So we are targeting planners, of course, we are targeting other practitioners in conservation and other areas to to use some of the tools that can help you understand or go through this process, the likes of a ecosystem services matrix, toolkit for ecosystem services site-based assessment, the use and access of remote sensing and satellite data, as well as the issues of DIPSA, that's the drivers, pressures, state impact response model. So these are tools that we'll be training a few of your colleagues next week to see how they can be applied to help us come up with proper plans for some of the emerging towns in the region. Thank you so much.